terrific honor to introduce Mariko Silver, who is the president of Bennington College. I'm going to spend a minute or two on her background so you get the full understanding of this extraordinary leader. Just a couple of bullet points. Education, undergraduate degree Yale, history, master's degree in science and technology, University of Sussex in England, PhD in economic geography from UCLA. Career, 2001, age 23, technology policy specialist in the office of the executive vice provost, Columbia University. Then to Arizona State University as director of strategic projects. In 2008, two big events. She got married to professional musician Tom LeBay, and then joined Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano's team as a policy advisor on innovation, economic development, and higher education. In 2009, the governor was named Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, and Mariko moved to Washington as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Policy. And from that post, she was recruited to Bennington College in 2014, where she has brought new vision to the school that Forbes now ranks as one of the top 5 U.S. entrepreneurial colleges and calls it one of tomorrow's hot colleges. I had the great privilege of working with Mariko when she and I were members of the Southern Vermont Economic Development Zone Committee in 2015-16. She is a great contributor. She is quick, to the point, impatient with the obvious, and eager for new insights. She is goal-oriented and energetic, a working mother with 2 children, and someone worth listening to, which we are about to do.
Taller than I am. Okay. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm setting my timer. I know we're also starting a little bit late. I don't have any slides. I don't have any PowerPoint. Wayne did leave one thing out of that introduction, which is that I got the call about joining Governor Napolitano's administration while I was on my honeymoon. And my husband said, "Don't answer your phone." And I said, "I have to answer the phone. I think it's the governor." So anyway, that's pretty much what our marriage is like, so if anybody was wondering about that. So I want to talk a little bit, I was asked to talk a little bit about the Arizona experience today, and then I'm going to dig into Vermont. So while I moved here most directly from Washington, D.C., as Wayne said, I spent about 9 years working on questions of economic development in Arizona. I moved to Arizona in 2001, 2002, because I think in academic years, every year has 2 years in it. 2001, 2002. Has anybody been to Metro Phoenix? So what do you remember most about Metro Phoenix? Sprawl. They are. And hot as Hades. It is an unbelievably hot place. And just like people here know, the difference between 0 and -10 is real. People there know the difference between 105 and 115 is real. And when I moved to Arizona, it was very much an economy built on what they call the 5 C's: citrus, climate, cattle, copper, and cotton. That's another way to say it was not a 21st century economy. Obviously, Phoenix metro area, 5 million people, it's a big city, or an agglomeration of a bunch of small cities into one big sprawl, as somebody said. So in some sense, it's very different from Vermont. But it was absolutely in a time of transition. And what I was asked to talk about a little bit today is how Metro Phoenix made that transition. Some of what it took. I'm not going to get into the level of detail that the mayor of Holyoke did, which was fascinating, by the way. I don't know if he's still here, but that was really terrific. But But I do want to talk about some of the bigger concepts embedded in that transition. Now, in the case of Metro Phoenix, it was a transition from those 5 C's, which any school child in Arizona can rattle off for you. It was a transition from those 5 C's to a very research and technology intensive economy. And I think sometimes from where we sit in Arizona, you can look at a big city and say, well, easy for them. Not so easy. It was incredibly hard, and it required a kind of relentlessness that I actually had not yet experienced in working on questions of policy. When you take my master's degree is in science and technology policy, and when you take a policy degree, they don't ever actually talk about the relentless human effort that's required. They talk about the levers, they talk about the tools, you look at a lot of graphs and econometric models. They hardly ever talk about the enormous, relentless human effort that is required. And that enormous, relentless human effort takes a lot of different forms. That's everybody from the small producer to the politicians. But really, the thing that I saw in Metro Phoenix is what it requires is a vision. And I'll say a couple of words about what I mean about vision. Some people hear the word vision and what they translate that to in their head is strategic plan. That's important. Some people hear the word vision and what they translate that into is a highfalutin thing that's not grounded in reality. That's actually important too. When I say vision, I also don't mean, by the way, that everybody has to agree. And maybe I'm speaking from both my Phoenix experience and my Vermont experience so far in this, as well as, by the way, my Washington, D.C. experience, which is that if you go into the idea of crafting a vision with the sense that everybody has to agree, you will never come out with anything that looks like a vision at all. You will either come out with a laundry list, or you will come out with a platitude. You will not come out with anything that looks like a vision at all. And when I say relentless, and relentless human engagement in the work, that connection to the vision and hanging on to that vision, not when it's obvious that for whatever reason some aspect of it doesn't work, but when you come up against all kinds of opposition, is an essential element in transformative policy. It doesn't mean not listening. In order to be relentless and do it well, you have to be an extraordinary listener. It doesn't mean giving no ground, because in order to be a leader, you always have to give ground. But it does mean being relentless in pursuing your vision, even as it may change over time. So one of the things, and then I will stop talking about Phoenix, but Phoenix has a lot of problems. And it still has a lot of problems. It's about 5 million people, as I said, it's hot as Hades. It has grossly underfunded schools. Depending on who your friends are on Facebook, you might have seen, and I'm not gonna say too much about Arizona politics here, but you might have seen some of the ugliness of Arizona politics, the striking teachers, and so on and so forth. It also now has more than 285 technology companies with offices in the downtown area as of 2017-18, compared to just 67 6 years ago. If you went to downtown Phoenix 10 years ago and you went today, you would not recognize it. The only way you'd be able to get around is because it's a very clear grid and they haven't moved the streets except for 1 or 2. But it is a completely different place. And yes, that takes money, and yes, that takes all kinds of effort, absolutely takes policy changes, but it takes a vision. That level of economic development, even scaled to our southern Vermont area, doesn't take place without a vision. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that vision and how it came to be. When Michael Crow, who was my boss at Columbia and was then president of Arizona State University, became president of Arizona State University, he had already been going back and forth to I was gonna say Vermont, to Arizona quite a bit. And he had a pretty good sense that Arizona State University, in this particular case, Arizona State University, was an under-realized research institution. So he stood in front of a room like this, and talked about how Arizona State University was going to become excellent, how it was going to double its research expenditures in X number of years, how it was going to create X number of jobs, how it was going to redevelop downtown Phoenix. And somebody stood up in the back, I don't actually know who it was, and said, I've been at Arizona State for 30 years, and we've always been mediocre and we've been happy. What's the matter with being mediocre? And I'll tell you, Michael's not one to lose his temper in public, but I think I saw steam come out of his ears. So that's just one example of the kinds of pushback that he got. Every single thing he put on the table, every single thing, there was pushback. There is always somebody who doesn't like an idea, even when the idea is really good. And not everybody can see into the future. Not everybody can see how a policy change here is going to make an extraordinary impact 10 years from now. And frankly, I work with 18 to 25-year-olds most of the time. Not everybody has the patience. Not everybody has the patience to pull it through those 10 years and to be relentless in those 10 years. I went to a lot of economic development speeches when I lived in Arizona. And I was very young at the time. Of course, now I'm very old. I was very young at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, he says the same thing over and over again. And I realized, oh, that's the job. The job is to say the same thing over and over again until you change the story. You integrate the feedback that you have, but you say the same thing over and over again until you change people's minds by changing the story. So, are any of you familiar with the Weekly Yonder, or the Daily Yonder? One. Did I send it to you, Dimitri? Two. Three. Okay. So I would recommend, for anyone interested, that you sign up for their newsletter. So the Weekly Yonder is an online publication. The Daily Yonder is their daily, or actually more like weekly, email blast. And it's about rural economic development. And it is chock full of interesting ideas and things that people have done on a shoestring and policy changes that people have made that have transformed their towns. There are very few cities that are covered by the Daily Yonder, and the ones that are, Phoenix and New York would not recognize as cities. And it happened that I got their email blast this morning. There's a story in it entitled Brain Gain, Professionals Find Niche in Rural Upper Midwest. And it's talking about a place called Shullsburg, Wisconsin, not a place that I'm familiar with, population 1,209. And it's talking about why people are moving back there to raise their families, why doctors are moving back there, why lawyers are moving back there, why all kinds of professionals are moving back there. And there's a quote in here. It says, the stereotype is that there isn't anybody left in rural America, and those that are, they're all on opioids. We need to rewrite the rural narrative. People don't move to your town for pity. They move for opportunities. Nobody cares that you lost the hardware store 30 years ago, and we are not all farmers. We haven't all been farmers for 100 years. So he's talking about Shullsburg, is that what he said? Shullsburg, Wisconsin. But the point there to me is about the importance of narrative, and we heard a little bit about that from the mayor over lunch. The importance not just of unpacking the false narrative, because by the way, you can go down the rabbit hole unpacking the false narrative and thereby actually reinforce the false narrative, but by taking control of the new narrative. So part of the relentlessness is optimism. It doesn't mean being positive when things are hard necessarily all the time, but it's about modeling in leadership a kind of resilience that you want to see in your economy and your community. And I think by all of our very presence here today, we are reaching for that narrative, we are reaching for that resilience, and we are reaching for that future-looking combination of policy and engagement and working together to enhance Southern Vermont. So before I moved here, 5 years ago now, I did a little research about Bennington County, and since then about Windham County, thinking about population size. And it drew to mind for me one of the exercises that we did when I lived in Arizona to get the legislature to change some of their policies. Among them, the way that they funded research universities and the way they thought about, in the case of Phoenix, investments in research, technology, and education. We did a very simple exercise. We looked at the physical geography of Metro Phoenix and of Arizona. Just the physical size, square miles. And we looked at the population size. And we thought about what places are comparable in the world to Arizona by either of those measures. In some ways, it's a little bit facile and silly, right? Because what you're trained to look at is GDP, what you're trained to look at is employment, and any number of other things. But what we found is that it was too hard for people, for the most part, to enter into the conversation through those avenues. It was too hard, because GDP, if you're talking about the GDP of Singapore, for example, it just feels so abstract. And it's hard to wrap your mind around those numbers. And it's easy to say, well, but that's Singapore. But everybody can get their mind around numbers of people, and everybody can get their mind around physical size, more or less. My husband will tell you that I'm spatially challenged, but most people can get their mind around physical size. And it enabled us, in this example, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the approach for Southern Vermont, but to get our minds around what we wanted to accomplish and who else, who was by some measure our size, had done it. So we stopped looking at California, and we stopped looking at Iowa, because we were looking at research universities. We started looking at Singapore and Ireland, and thinking much bigger about what those places had been able to do that we might want to do. Which doesn't mean we're going to become Singapore or Ireland, we Arizona at that time, because we have the federal government, we have a whole different infrastructure, but it enabled us to imagine in a different way. And if you can't imagine, then you can't have a vision. If you can't imagine into the future, you can't actually write a strategic plan really worth anything, in my view. You have to imagine yourself into the place that you want to be. And that's what the visioning piece is really about. And when we imagine the place that we want to be as Vermont, we have to think about, of course, Southern Vermont. We, of course, have to think about what are the aspects of what we have that we value, that we want to maintain. And also, what is going to go away whether we like it or not? And what's coming whether we like it or not? Now, I spend a lot of time, because I'm training, I'm overseeing an institution that trains people for a next generation of work and life satisfaction and creativity and being in the world. And because, too, as most of you know, we have a 7-week work term at Bennington. So we are constantly moving our students back and forth between the world of work and the world of education on our campus. So I think a lot about the future of work. So some things that are coming, or are frankly already here. Automation, AI, robotics, a number of different layers of automation. And as a result of that, structural unemployment and the need for reskilling, the need for thinking differently about education overall. That's pre-K all the way through to lifelong learning. Which doesn't mean that preschool kids shouldn't play with blocks. In fact, it means that they should play with blocks. Right? They don't have to learn how to code before they learn how to read. But it does mean thinking back through what is it that people will need to survive and thrive. Because also, by the way, life is not only about work. You can all tell my husband that I said that out loud, that life is not only about work. Thinking about the ways in which those skills are portable and reshapeable over time. And also at the national level, openness to immigration and trade, to the movement of people, to the movement of ideas. Those are all aspects of both what we are going to see and what we need to see in order to continue to be competitive. And all of those things relate, they have to relate to our vision for the future of Southern Vermont. Also, the workforce is changing, and I see a couple of people here who I know are experts in the millennial workforce. But the students we see graduating today, millennials and into Gen Z, They're moving to affordable mid-sized cities with jobs. They're moving to middle America, away from the coast, because they can't afford to live on the coasts. And a key draw is affordability coupled with job availability. And an enormous part of that is rental and starter housing. And of course they want stuff to do, they want things to eat, they want places to go, but I think sometimes we shut down, in a way, the conversation in southern Vermont about what millennials want, saying, well, we're not what they want because they want to go out all night. Not actually necessarily true. What they want is vibrancy, and vibrancy can take many different forms. So they're moving to Colorado Springs, which will soon be unaffordable. They're moving to San Antonio, they're moving to Denver. And they're thinking a lot about not just where they work, but how they work. They want freelance, as it says in the Deloitte Millennial Survey, freelance flexibility with full-time stability. That means we have to think about the entire worker experience. And think about it, in fact, not as a worker experience, but as a human experience and a community experience. So they want places they work to be involved in social issues and change, even if they're not working for a social issues and change business. They want to know that the business motivations and ethics are aligned. And they want flexibility in their time. They're open to multiple different ways of making a living. And they want to be able to change over time. And from managers, they want transparency, plain talk, and real feedback. So even if we were just to take those questions, because we know, and I won't review the stats here, that Vermont is aging, and that we are losing population, in part because of that aging. And that the elephant in the room in all of these conversations is, how are we going to build up the next generation of Vermonters? And I'll just close with this, and then I wanted to open it up and just try a little group exercise. Some of you have heard me talk a little bit about my move to southern Vermont. And Wayne said I have kids, but he didn't say that they're 4 and 6. I'd like to have play dates with Kayla's kids. They're 4 and 6. And of course we thought about schools when we were moving here, but we thought, of course, too, about quality of life. And we have friends who visit us all the time from Brooklyn and various other places. And it really hit me what an extraordinary childhood experience it is here. When our friends from Brooklyn came, stayed at our house, where, for a couple of you who have been to our house, there are 3 sort of tiered fields out behind the house. So if the kids go past the first field, you can't see them. And if they go to the second field, you might not see them for a couple hours. And my kids are 4 and 6, and a 6-year-old came to visit us, and we sent them off into the field. And the whole time they were gone, my friend, who's the father of the other 6-year-old, was freaking out. He was like, where are they? Where did they go? He's never been out of my sight. Oh, man. They were gone for 2 hours. 2 of them came back without shirts. 1 of them came back without pants. It's okay. I'll let you guess, Kayla, which one came back without pants. But it's one of the great benefits of being here. And we don't make enough of it. We don't make enough of it to the outside world. People are hungry for new ways to live. They are hungry for new ways to pursue a fulfilling life. People in their 30s and 40s in particular, but probably also people in their 20s. When I talk to students at Bennington, often when they arrive, let's say they come from New York City, at first they're thinking like, how can I get back to the city? There's nothing to do here. By the time they leave, many of them can't imagine living the rest of their lives in a city. But we can't rely on students to spend 4 years here to figure that out. We have to share what is extraordinary about this place in a way that people who have never been here can understand, and in a way that speaks to them where they are. We think a lot about this when we think about bringing students to Bennington, and as most of you know, about 98% of our students come from outside of Vermont. How do we help them to imagine the ways in which a place they have never been will help them to become the people they want to be. So if we were to pose to ourselves that question and put it in the context of Southern Vermont, I know we don't have a lot of time here, but I wanted you all to take 3 minutes at your tables and talk about how you would take on that question. How would you take on that question of helping people to imagine the ways in which being here would help people who have never been here to understand how coming to Southern Vermont, or living this kind of a life, whatever that means to you, can help them imagine how to become the people they want to be and live the lives that they want to live. So if you all will take 3 minutes, and I'll try to actually time it, and then we'll ask for a few people to report out, and then we'll take some questions and answers. So I know I didn't give you enough time to really answer the question. Although I suspect maybe some of you had an answer already. But I'm going to ask if there are a couple of tables who want to report out a little bit on what you talked about. Sarah, Coffee, do you want to say a little bit about what you guys are talking about at your table? I see you right in front of me and I know your name, so.
Thanks, Mariko. Can you hear me? I love it that it takes, everyone's so excited about this exercise. And someone at our table said you get an educator to do this, to get people engaged in the topic. At our table, we were talking about the things that mattered to people. People started with their stories like living in small size. The scale of our communities enables us to be engaged with each other, and the accessibility to people and to experiences in nature. And I think, just as somebody who moved here with 2 little kids, 2 and 3 years old from New York, moving back here because I went to college here, it's just like when my friends come and visit me too, they're just like blown away by the experiences that our kids have here. And I think our schools is something that I was going to say is, I think, are really, really precious. The kinds of education that our kids get here is really, really different than what other kids get in the U.S., and we have to fight for keeping that.
So what if, for example, we held up, and I know school politics are complicated, right? We decided that we were going to hold up a Vermont education, K-12, a Vermont education, as a very specific asset. For example, not to be overly child-focused. Yes? I saw a hand or a pen in the air. Sorry, can you say who you are? Sorry, Sarah, I know you've seen.
Zach Hale from Bennington with Hale Resources. So you can't really give someone an imagination, so we were thinking why not like a Southern Vermont Instagram and have like one family take it for a week and actually show them what it's like to live in Vermont.
A kind of co-op approach in a way, or community approach to helping people to imagine. Anybody else want to? Yeah. Go ahead. Spirits of Old Bennington.
Hi, I'm Ken Lorenz, speaking for our table. One thing we kind of hit on that surprised us was how do we change the narrative of Vermont from Vermont as vacation only to Vermont as a place to live? Because all the marketing and all the stuff that you see online about Vermont is really just come here and have a good weekend, not come here and raise a family. I think the state of stay has changed that, but kind of changing and owning that narrative of this is a place to live. Because I have 2 free-range children also.
We got to get in that hashtag free-range parenting. Seriously.
So we know that if you can get people to come up here and let them free range in your backyard for a while, you can probably hook them. But the question is how you get them to come up here. And so our thought is the state of Vermont should open a storefront in New York City on 5th Avenue at Rockefeller Center. and call it the Embassy of Vermont. And they should have experiential things in there, videos and virtual reality, but also people like they have in the Apple stores, which are, by the way, the most successful retail stores by square foot in the United States. And if you've ever walked into one, there's somebody who grabs you right away and says, what can I help you with? And there's no cash registers. They give you what you want, they have the iPad, you sign, you're out. It's a great experience. The state of Vermont could have good trained people in the store to basically convince you that you gotta go try Vermont. In Brooklyn too, yeah. In Boston, Cambridge.
My name is Carmen Thurby, and we came up with some just statements from our table. One of them is pull over and go swimming, because there's so many great swimming holes, and you can just do it at any time. And some people said with or without clothes, depending on where you are. Watch the sunrise, hear the quiet. Your neighbors will be deer and wild turkeys, and the sense of community. That can be the whole street, it can be just the 2 houses on your street, and that is something that it's a beautiful thing about our state.
One or two more? Yes.
Oh, sure.
I know we're at the same table, but we were talking about how our organization actually has no problem getting the young people to come. We attract them, but they won't stay because the dating pool is so very small. And they actually tell us that they want to stay, and there's just no one to date. And so if we could come up with some sort of, maybe a storefront for dating.
So I think that's very, you hit on something that I think is very important. Obviously, again, I'm spending most of my time with 18 to 25-year-olds when I'm not spending my time with 4 to 6-year-olds. But there's dating, but there's also just simply connecting. Because as someone who moved here as an adult, without any other ties, if I didn't have kids, and I didn't have the job that I have, I don't know that I would be able to figure out how to get connected to things, how to find out where things are, how to figure out, for example, I just had the experience of trying to figure out what summer camps to send my children to. And there's someone in this room whose wife keeps an extraordinary Google spreadsheet, but had I not had my kids in Little League with other kids there's a parent who knows about the spreadsheet, blah, blah, blah. Or if I were an introverted person, which I'm clearly not, but how would I figure out how to navigate this place? And there are people like Kayla who have started some extraordinary efforts on Facebook to connect people. In that case, it is moms with largely small kids. But if I were an unaffiliated person, say I wanted to move here to start a business, right? I might call, Zerwad and some of the other folks in Bennington, for example, if that's where I were moving, or Adam if I were moving over here. But figuring out how to get connected socially is a major barrier. It's a major barrier, and even if there are people in this room who say, well, no, it's not that hard, you know that. But the people who are moving here don't know that. And so figuring out how we can crack the code on something like that, I think would be very important to millennials, and then also dating. Maybe not a storefront, maybe an online something, storefronts like this. Yes.
So I think that's all the time we have.
There's one more hand, can we do one more?
So I have an answer to what you would do if you came here alone and you didn't know anybody. You volunteer, you go down to your town office. If your eyes are closed, you get elected to something. And while you're there, they're going to tell you about Front Porch Forum. Then you sign on to Front Porch Forum. And then hopefully the state of Vermont will change its mind about getting rid of the magazine Vermont Living.
So take the volunteering, and then we'll close here. Volunteering is a great way to get embedded in a community. Not everybody, and I know this will sound strange, not everybody knows that they are welcome to volunteer. And so even if we created something around the vision, I know it sounds weird to people who are either grew up that way, or not everybody knows that they're welcome to volunteer. And so figuring out a way to push that out there, a Volunteer Vermont campaign that wasn't just about people who were living in Vermont, right, but was about the idea of community and pushing out the idea of community. I think figuring out what are the impediments and what are the hooks around some of these ideas is the starting point to really figuring out what is a vision. And the vision, by the way, in my view and in my experience, can't be all about economics. Can't be all about jobs. The jobs are an enormous part of it, but the reason that people don't come is not always because of jobs. And when students or young people talk about moving somewhere for opportunities, they're not necessarily thinking, many of them are, but they're not necessarily thinking, I'm moving there for an existing job. I'm moving there for the opportunity to create something. I'm moving there for the opportunity to be part of a community. I'm moving there for the opportunity to build something, to exercise an idea that I have in a welcoming environment. So I encourage you to think broadly about that idea of opportunities. And I just want to say thank you all for participating so wholeheartedly and for listening to me today. Thanks very much.